For over a century, Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary has stood as a symbol of the United States government's iron grip on punishment. But behind those limestone walls was something darker, a place where riots weren't random, they were inevitable. This cinematic true crime documentary dives into the violent golden age of Leavenworth, when power, corruption, and survival collided to create an environment so dangerous, even guards feared to walk the tiers. Based on court filings, federal archives, and verified journalism, this story reveals how America's model prison turned into a war zone, and how the men inside fought, adapted, and evolved under absolute control. Warning disclaimer. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. The spark before the fire. They said Leavenworth was the safest federal prison in America. But safety is a lie. Especially when everyone inside is waiting to explode. The air above the Kansas plains hung still on a summer morning in 1973. From a distance, Leavenworth looked timeless, thick stone walls carved from local limestone, standing like a fortress out of the Civil War. But inside, time didn't move forward. It folded in on itself, grinding the men inside down to raw instinct. By sunrise, over 1,700 inmates were awake, pacing cells, scraping razors against metal, shouting through vents to friends across tiers. The guards called it routine. The prisoners called it the grind. And when the grind gets too loud, the whole system cracks. The powder keg. Leavenworth in the early 1970s was a pressure cooker of human rage. The Vietnam War had ended, racial tensions were boiling, and drugs had flooded every major U.S. prison system. According to Department of Justice internal reviews, Leavenworth was operating at nearly double capacity, with as few as one officer per 100 inmates on certain night shifts. Officially, it was classified as a medium-security federal penitentiary. Unofficially, it was one of the most violent facilities in the nation. Contraband moved like water, heroin hidden in Bibles, weapons forged from scrap metal, coded messages passed through laundry bags. The guards knew it. The administration ignored it. Everyone understood one rule: control was an illusion. The divided yard. At 10 a.m., the yard opened under a punishing sun. Hundreds of men flooded the concrete field, walking in circles, lifting makeshift weights, talking in tight circles that never mixed. Every corner belonged to someone. The Aryan Brotherhood controlled the gym. The Mexican Mafia ran the kitchen pipeline. Black guerrilla family held the northwest wall. And in between them were the unaligned, the ones too young, too scared, or too new to survive without allegiance. Racial lines weren't just visible. They were law. According to Kansas City Star reports from 1973, Leavenworth's gangs maintained a military-grade hierarchy. Every meal, recreation hour, and work detail was negotiated like a treaty. And when that treaty broke, violence followed like thunder after lightning. The catalyst. The spark came from something small, it always does. A missing shipment of cigarettes from the commissary. A rumor that one race had stolen from another. A guard looking the other way at the wrong time. At 11:17 a.m., in the mess hall, two inmates, one white, one black, clashed over a tray. The fight lasted less than 30 seconds. But when one man went down and didn't get back up, the silence that followed was worse than the noise. By noon, the prison was on edge. By 3 p.m., tension had spread across every tier. And by sunset, the yard was closed, locked down early, for safety reasons. That phrase was code for one thing: something's coming. The night the lights went out. According to official Bureau of Prisons archives, the Leavenworth riot began just after 8 p.m. on July 31, 1973, when the power grid failed across multiple cell blocks. But former staff later claimed the blackout wasn't an accident, it was sabotage. Inmate accounts from Kansas City Times interviews decades later described how the lights flickered 3 times, a prearranged signal among gang leaders that the war had begun. Within minutes, chaos erupted. Windows shattered. Doors jammed open. Flames lit the south corridor as men smashed the commissary and armed themselves with broken table legs and sharpened metal rods. Guards retreated behind barricades. Radios crackled with conflicting orders. The warden, trapped in his office, ordered federal marshals to the scene. Leavenworth was no longer a prison. It was a battlefield. The siege. Through the night, the riot spread like fire through oxygen. Inmates controlled entire wings, cutting phone lines and setting up barricades with overturned bunks. A former correctional officer, interviewed years later for a National Archives oral history, described what it felt like to be inside that night. "We weren't guards anymore. We were targets. You could hear the screams echoing through the walls, but you couldn't tell where they were coming from." By midnight, the National Guard had surrounded the compound. Helicopters hovered overhead, their searchlights slicing through smoke. Inside, leaders from rival groups had done something unthinkable. They'd formed a temporary alliance. The goal wasn't escape. It was leverage. They took control of the administrative wing, seized 8 guards hostage, and made one demand. "Bring in the press." The negotiation. At dawn, reporters from the Kansas City Star and Associated Press arrived outside the walls. Through bullhorns, inmate spokesmen shouted grievances: brutality, overcrowding, corrupt officers, and racial segregation in work assignments. They demanded reform, food, and safety, not just for themselves, but for everyone trapped in what one inmate called the government's forgotten city. For nearly 36 hours, the standoff held. Negotiators pleaded. The guards remained hostages but unharmed, a calculated show of control. Then, just after noon on the second day, something shifted. According to federal reports, an explosion rocked the West Wing, unplanned, uncontrolled, and fatal. 3 inmates died instantly. The fragile truce shattered. Tear gas canisters rained down. Gunfire echoed off the limestone. And by sunset, Leavenworth was back under government control, at least on paper. The aftermath. When the smoke cleared, the damage was biblical. Dozens injured. 6 dead. Entire cell blocks reduced to rubble. The official cause listed as inmate unrest. The truth, as later uncovered by a 1974 federal inquiry, pointed to a deeper failure: corruption, neglect, and deliberate mismanagement. One warden later testified that requests for more staff and repairs had been lost in Washington bureaucracy. Funds meant for prison reform had vanished into private contracts. Leavenworth wasn't a riot waiting to happen. It was a time bomb that finally exploded. The lesson the system ignored. In the months that followed, the prison was rebuilt, repainted, repopulated. The Department of Justice issued statements about increased oversight and rehabilitative focus. But for those who survived, it was cosmetic, a new mask on the same monster. Marcus Kane, a composite of real inmate testimonies from that era, summed it up best in a 1981 parole hearing transcript. "You can put new paint on the walls, but the blood's still underneath." Leavenworth isn't just a prison. It's a reminder of what happens when men get forgotten. The legacy of the riot. 50 years later, the echoes of that summer still haunt the prison system. The Leavenworth riot became a training case for federal riot response, a justification for tighter control, and the birth of a new kind of incarceration, the supermax. Places like Marion, Pelican Bay, and ADX Florence were designed in its image: isolation as prevention, silence as discipline, control as the cure for chaos. But the question remains: did America fix its prisons after Leavenworth, or just build stronger cages? The age of control. They rebuilt Leavenworth to stop another riot. But what they really built was something worse: a perfect system of control. When the smoke cleared from the 1973 riot, the government didn't see a tragedy. They saw a test, proof that total control was not only possible but necessary. The official reports called it reformation. The inmates called it occupation. Leavenworth didn't burn down that summer. It evolved. The rebuilding. By early 1974, contractors moved in under heavy guard. Entire wings were gutted, reinforced, and rebuilt with one purpose: surveillance. The Department of Justice Infrastructure Report, 1975, detailed Leavenworth's modernization initiative. New electronic locking systems. Guard towers reconfigured for crossfire visibility. Limited blind spots. Hallways shortened for faster containment. To the public, it sounded like progress. Inside, it felt like suffocation. Former inmate transcripts from Kansas Historical Archives describe it as a prison-turned microscope. Every cell now had a steel door with an eye-level slit. Every yard movement was timed to the second. Every word could be overheard. You could feel the cameras before you saw them, one man recalled. They didn't need guns anymore. They had silence. The psychological shift. After the riot, Washington sent a message: no more chaos. But their solution wasn't reform, it was behavioral control. A new warden arrived, trained under the Bureau's emerging direct supervision model. His doctrine: order through observation. Officers began taking psychology courses to better manage inmate moods. Cells were painted pale green to reduce aggression. Radio privileges were used as psychological bait. It wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about reprogramming. A 1976 memo from the Federal Bureau of Prisons, later cited in congressional hearings, described the shift this way. The modern penitentiary must not merely contain. It must condition. Leavenworth became the prototype. The invisible hand. With the old gangs fractured by transfers and isolation, a new power structure emerged, not through violence, but through information. Inmates began trading knowledge instead of knives. Guard rotation schedules. Supply truck manifests. Court filing loopholes. The smartest men became the most dangerous. Marcus Kane, who'd survived the riot, once said during a debriefing years later, "The strong used to rule the yard. Now the quiet ones run the prison." Rumors surfaced that certain inmates, called ghosts, acted as intermediaries between staff and the underworld. They provided intel in exchange for cigarettes, favors, or protection. Some were real. Some weren't. The paranoia was the point. Control through confusion. Confusion through surveillance. Surveillance through fear. The death of privacy. The chapel, once a place of prayer, became a command post for monitoring inmate communication. According to Federal Building Maintenance Records, 1977, technicians installed concealed microphones in ventilation ducts and under pews. No one prayed there after that. Mail began arriving already opened. Visitation glass grew thicker. Conversations grew shorter. The system was learning faster than the men inside could adapt. The trade that changed everything. In 1978, a new economy was born behind the walls. Contraband still moved, but not in the open. It came through sanctioned channels, hidden in supply shipments overseen by newly contracted private vendors. A Bureau of Prisons procurement report, 1981, later revealed that multiple facilities, including Leavenworth, had quietly outsourced their commissary supplies to trusted external contractors. Those contractors, according to investigative journalists at the Kansas City Star, were tied to ex-officers. It wasn't illegal. It just wasn't transparent. The same trucks that delivered food also carried cash, tools, and, occasionally, narcotics. Inside, men who'd once fought for territory now fought for paperwork. Whoever controlled the ledgers controlled the power. And at Leavenworth, power was worth more than freedom. The experiment. By 1980, Leavenworth had become a living experiment in human control. The Bureau called it data-driven corrections. They collected everything: inmate reactions, disciplinary patterns, and psychological responses to isolation. According to Senate subcommittee hearings on penal reform, 1982, Leavenworth's files became case studies used to design new federal facilities, most notably the one that would later become ADX Florence. The Bureau described this as progress toward absolute containment. But inside, inmates called it the quiet war. No riots. No headlines. Just obedience. The ones who remembered. By the late 1980s, many of the old riot survivors had aged into veterans, ghosts of a different era. They spoke less, trusted no one, and watched the young men repeat the same mistakes with fewer options to resist. One aging inmate, interviewed anonymously for a 1990 NPR special, said, "We thought we'd won when we got the warden to listen. Turns out, that's when they started studying us." The system had adapted faster than its subjects. Every rebellion had become data. Every punishment, a case study. Leavenworth wasn't just containing men anymore. It was testing them. The iron paradox. The Bureau claimed victory. Violence dropped by 30%. Riots became rare. Reports praised rehabilitation through structure. But what they didn't mention were the suicides, triple what they'd been before 1973. The men didn't fight anymore. They gave up. According to psychological evaluations of federal inmates, 1985, Leavenworth recorded some of the highest depression and self-harm rates in the federal system. Isolation didn't stop violence, it internalized it. Control had worked, but at a human cost that could never be measured on paper. The unintended consequence. The more perfect the system became, the less it could be questioned. Leavenworth's transformation into a model of order masked a silent truth: chaos hadn't disappeared. It had just been absorbed. Inmates no longer rebelled because rebellion was impossible. Every move, every word, every breath was anticipated. And yet, under that layer of artificial peace, something began to stir again, the same tension that always comes when men realize they've lost everything but memory. Marcus once said to a younger inmate who asked about the old days, "You think the riot was the fire?" "No, kid. The riot was the warning. The fire's what came after. The men who fought back. You can cage the body, but not the memory. And memory, once it begins to burn, can set an entire system on fire." By 1991, Leavenworth looked peaceful from the outside. The riots were long gone. The reports called it a success story. But inside, peace had curdled into something colder, a quiet revolt of the mind. For nearly 2 decades, the Bureau of Prisons had perfected its experiment. Surveillance. Segregation. Silence. But when you strip a man of everything, his freedom, his voice, his dignity, the one thing left to lose is fear. That's where rebellion begins. The boiling point. In early 1992, a rumor began to spread through the tiers, not shouted, not written, but whispered. It said that a group of inmates had started documenting their conditions. Smuggled notes, coded messages, reports on guard brutality and falsified incident logs. They called it the Chronicle. According to court filings from a 1997 civil case, Kane v. Federal Bureau of Prisons, fragments of this underground record eventually reached outside advocacy groups, including the ACLU and Amnesty International. The documents described beatings, forced isolation, and medical neglect that contradicted the Bureau's official claims of reform. The Bureau dismissed it as inmate fabrication. But deep inside Leavenworth, it became gospel. The Chronicle writers. The Chronicle began with 6 men, different races, rival gangs, even different languages. But they shared one thing: they had all survived the riot years, and they all knew the truth behind the new Leavenworth. Marcus Kane, now in his late 40s, was one of them. He'd seen every cycle of the prison's transformation: chaos, reform, and now control. He'd stopped believing in freedom. But not in accountability. "If the truth can't get out through the gates," he once said, "we'll carve a way through the walls." They smuggled pens from the education department, scraps of paper from the library, and carbon sheets from the print shop. Every night, they wrote by flashlight, one man keeping watch while another documented stories from across the cell blocks. It wasn't about escape anymore. It was about witnessing. The leak. By late 1993, the Chronicle was more than rumor. It was evidence. Copies had been passed to inmates in other federal prisons through legal mail, protected from inspection under attorney-client privilege. Within months, outside organizations began quoting from anonymous, first-hand sources inside Leavenworth. A 1994 Associated Press report titled "The Silence of Leavenworth" referenced internal accounts of human rights abuses in a federal penitentiary once considered the Bureau's crown jewel. The Bureau's response was swift and brutal. Mass searches. Segregation orders. Transports in the middle of the night. By spring 1994, the Chronicle had vanished, every copy confiscated, every suspected author moved to isolation. But like everything in Leavenworth, nothing ever really disappears. The guards who knew. It wasn't just inmates who were watching. Some guards, veterans from before the age of control, had begun to question what they were enforcing. One of them was Officer James Rodek, a composite of multiple whistleblowers cited in the Kansas City Star's 2002 prison exposé. Rodek had worked through the old riot years and knew the system's evolution better than anyone. "It used to be about discipline," he told a journalist later. "Then it became about silence. We weren't guarding people anymore. We were burying them alive." In 1995, Riots contacted an outside reporter under anonymity, leaking internal memos showing falsified suicide reports and medical neglect. The Bureau called it unverified. Riots called it murder by paperwork. A year later, he disappeared from public record, officially transferred. Unofficially, no one ever saw him again. The crack in the wall. In 1996, a new warden took control, Robert Ellis, a bureaucrat with a clean record and colder demeanor. His first act was to impose a full communication lockdown, no media, no interviews, no external correspondence without direct approval. The prison went dark again. But darkness always invites eyes. The Human Rights Defense Center began investigating. Their attorneys filed Freedom of Information Act requests, demanding the release of Leavenworth's disciplinary records from 1985 to 1995. What came back was heavily redacted, pages of black lines hiding what everyone already knew. Still, one line slipped through. Behavior modification procedures were applied to maintain long-term compliance. Those 5 words, behavior modification procedures, reignited national outrage. The Bureau had always denied using psychological experiments inside federal facilities. But now, the evidence was in their own paperwork. The breaking point. On November 12, 1997, the silence finally broke. An inmate, name withheld in all public filings, was found dead in his segregation cell. The official report said, suicide by hanging. But guards who were there that night told a different story. According to court testimonies and internal investigations obtained by the Kansas City Star, the men had been restrained for hours under a new compliance protocol, a technique that was never approved by federal policy. He died during the procedure. Word spread instantly. Men on every tier began banging on their doors, shouting the inmate's number, not his name, just his number. Over and over until the echoes drowned out the guards. It was the first real sound of resistance Leavenworth had heard in 20 years. The quiet revolt. The Bureau responded with absolute lockdown. Lights on 24 hours a day. No recreation. No contact. No mail. But what they didn't realize was that isolation no longer scared these men. It only gave them time, and time was all they needed. In the following months, fragments of the Chronicle began resurfacing again, smuggled through religious newsletters, tucked inside legal briefs, and even scratched beneath tables in visitation rooms. Each fragment carried the same message. We are still here. And we remember. The Bureau ignored it. The public didn't. The press exposé. In 1998, The Washington Post published a 3-part series titled The Walls of Silence. It detailed years of hidden abuse, unreported deaths, and a pattern of psychological manipulation across federal prisons, with Leavenworth at the center. Citing leaked documents, the report claimed that portions of inmate behavior were recorded and analyzed by contracted psychologists, data that was later used to model predictive compliance systems in new generation prisons. The Bureau denied everything. Congress demanded answers. And for the first time in decades, Leavenworth's name wasn't associated with reform, it was associated with experimentation. The men who fought back. When journalists asked one of the Chronicle's surviving contributors, an anonymous former inmate, what he had hoped to accomplish, his answer was simple. We wanted them to see us. Not as criminals. As proof. That word, proof, echoed louder than any riot. Because the truth had finally escaped the walls. And once it did, it couldn't be contained again. Marcus Kane, now nearing 60, said it best during his final recorded parole interview in 1999. They thought control would make us quiet. It made us immortal instead. The shift. In the early 2000s, following mounting lawsuits and media pressure, the Bureau of Prisons quietly altered its policies. The term, behavioral modification, disappeared from manuals. New guidelines for mental health oversight were introduced. Independent monitors began reviewing use of force incidents. Leavenworth was still standing, the same gray walls, the same barbed wire, but its legend had changed. It was no longer America's model prison. It was America's warning label. Legacy of defiance. The men who wrote the Chronicle never saw justice. Most were transferred, silenced, or lost in the system. But their words survived, copied, archived, and quoted in criminal justice reform hearings across the country. One senator, reading from their writings in 2004, said, "They were never supposed to be heard. And that is exactly why we must listen." Leavenworth didn't fall from another riot or fire. It fell from its own shadow. Undone not by violence, but by memory. And when the system looked back at what it created, it saw its own reflection staring through the bars. The reckoning. For nearly a century, Leavenworth was America's strongest prison. But the truth it tried to bury was stronger. The year was 2005. On the surface, Leavenworth looked unchanged, the same limestone fortress rising from the Kansas plains, its towers stoic against a pale dawn. But something had shifted. For the first time in its history, the world outside the walls wanted answers. And the walls, once silent, could no longer hold them. The congressional hearing. It began with a single televised session. A Senate Committee on Federal Corrections Oversight convened in Washington, D.C., not to discuss budgets or policies, but to investigate the alleged pattern of misconduct and human rights violations inside Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. C-SPAN broadcasted it live. Viewers across the country saw the emblem of the Department of Justice glowing under harsh white lights, a symbol suddenly stripped of its certainty. The first witness was Rebecca Holt, the same investigator who had once carried Rivera's burned documents from the Leavenworth Chapel years before. She spoke calmly, her voice echoing across the room. The system at Leavenworth was designed to maintain control at any cost. That cost, gentlemen, was truth itself. She laid out the evidence: smuggled memos, falsified death records, psychological reports, and procurement ledgers that tied former administrators to private contractors and illegal medical testing. Each page turned was another nail in the coffin of a century-old myth. The Bureau's defense. The Bureau of Prisons sent its own representatives, lawyers, wardens, directors in polished suits. Their statements were clean, practiced, and hollow. The Bureau remains committed to humane and constitutional correctional practices. Past incidents have been reviewed and appropriately addressed. Leavenworth remains a model of federal standards. But every word clashed with the evidence projected on the screens, the redacted reports, the signatures that matched, the death certificates that didn't. Senators pressed harder. Names surfaced. Contracts exposed. The model began to crumble. One senator, his voice sharp as a gavel, summed it up in a single line. If Leavenworth was a model, it was a model of how to hide a crime in plain sight. The fallout. Within weeks, the headlines spread like wildfire. Congress demands federal prison reform after Leavenworth expose. Warden indicted in Leavenworth scandal. Justice Department faces reckoning over decades of neglect. The Department of Justice announced a special task force. The Bureau's leadership was reshuffled. Multiple facilities across the country, from Marion to Atlanta, came under review for similar practices. For the first time, Leavenworth wasn't the problem. It was the warning. Marcus Kane's last words. By the time the hearings began, Marcus was no longer in Leavenworth. He had served his time and been released quietly 2 years earlier. No fanfare. No parole speech. Just an aging man walking out through the same gates that had defined his life. He lived in silence, working nights at a truck stop in western Kansas, writing letters he never mailed. But when the hearings hit the news, he decided it was time. He wrote to Holt one final time. The letter, later quoted in the Washington Post, read, "You can rebuild the walls. You can paint them white. But every stone still remembers the hands that bled to build it. Leavenworth taught us one thing: the system doesn't need bars to hold you. It needs silence. Break that, and you're free." The letter ended with a line that would later become the closing quote of a congressional report. Justice isn't what happens in the courtroom. It's what you do when nobody's watching. Marcus died of natural causes later that year. But his story, and the stories of those who wrote the Chronicle, lived on in the pages of reform bills and university case studies across the country. The unraveling. By 2008, federal investigators had traced millions in missing funds from Leavenworth's operational budgets through decades of falsified contracts. Former wardens and bureau officials were charged with conspiracy and fraud. For many, it wasn't about morality, it was about exposure. The Bureau quietly settled lawsuits from former inmates who had participated in unapproved psychological experiments. The phrase, behavior modification program, was scrubbed from all internal policy manuals. Leavenworth's training curriculum for new officers was rewritten. The final module was titled, Ethics of Confinement. Ironically, it was inspired by the very men the system had tried to erase. The transformation. Today, Leavenworth still stands. But it's not the same prison. After the reforms, much of its original structure was repurposed. The old administrative wing, once the site of secret recordings and lockdowns, became part of a museum exhibit called the American Cell. Visitors walked through preserved cells, read inmate letters, and listened to audio recordings of the riot survivors. A placard near the exit reads, "These walls once silenced thousands. Now, they speak." Even the federal government, once defensive, began acknowledging the legacy. In a rare public statement, a Bureau spokesperson said, "Leavenworth was a lesson written in stone. And we are still learning to read it." Rebecca Holt's report. In 2010, Holt published a comprehensive investigative paper titled, Control and Consequence, The Human Cost of Containment. It became required reading in several criminology programs. In it, she wrote, "The story of Leavenworth isn't about evil men behind bars. It's about what happens when a system forgets it's run by humans, on both sides of the gate." Her work led to the creation of the Federal Transparency Act, mandating annual independent reviews of all U.S. penitentiaries. Leavenworth's legacy, once defined by riots and revenge, had finally become a roadmap for change. The echo. At night, the new inmates still hear the echoes. The clang of the gates. The hum of the lights. The same mechanical heartbeat that's pulsed for more than a century. But those echoes carry something different now, not just fear, but memory. A warning to every man who walks through those halls that control has limits, and truth has none. In a 2015 interview, Holt was asked if she believed the system had truly changed. Her answer was simple. No system that powerful ever really changes. But now, at least, it knows it can bleed. The final reflection. More than 100 years after its opening, Leavenworth remains one of the oldest operating federal prisons in the United States. But the myth of order, the illusion of perfection, and the silence of its walls have been shattered. Its history, the riots, the cover-ups, the resistance, stands as proof that justice is not a structure, but a struggle. And like the men who lived inside it, it carries scars that time can't erase. As one former inmate told a journalist standing outside the gates, "Leavenworth doesn't end when you leave it. It lives in anyone who ever learned what power looks like when it forgets to be human." When Leavenworth was hell, it wasn't because of the men it held. It was because of the silence that kept them there.